When Mr. Harding moved into the old Victorian house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the neighborhood was relieved. For years, the property had stood vacant, slowly succumbing to nature's relentless grip. The house was a decaying relic, its once grand facade marred by peeling paint, broken shutters, and an overgrown garden that spilled weeds onto the cracked sidewalk. Yet, there was something strangely alive about the place, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for a new occupant. Ellie, who lived 3 houses down, noticed the moving activity immediately. She stood by her window, peering through a crack in the curtains. A lone man stepped out of a black sedan, his silhouette casting a long shadow in the setting sun. He wore a long, dark coat that hung off his thin frame, too heavy for the mild autumn weather. His face, from what Ellie could make out, was gaunt, his skin unnaturally pale, and his eyes, even from a distance, they seemed oddly sunken, almost hollow. Finally, someone moved in, she muttered to herself. Yet as she watched him unload nothing more than a single small suitcase from the car, a chill ran down her spine. There was something off about this man. The first few days, Mr. Harding's presence in the neighborhood was almost non-existent. He spent most of his time inside, the lights in his house rarely coming on, even at night. Occasionally, Ellie would see him walking around his property at dusk, his figure blending eerily into the twilight shadows. No moving trucks came, no furniture was brought in. Neighbors began to talk, speculating about who he was and what he was doing in that dilapidated house. One evening, while taking out the trash, Ellie caught a glimpse of him standing at his front window. He was staring directly at her, his face partially obscured by the grimy glass. She felt a sharp pang of fear as his gaze bored into her, unmoving, unblinking. She quickly turned away, hurried back inside, and locked the door behind her. He's probably just strange, she told herself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. There's nothing to worry about. Despite her attempts to ignore it, the sense of dread grew. Each day, Mr. Harding's peculiar behavior became more unsettling. He began taking nightly walks around the block at precisely midnight. Ellie could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside her window as he passed, a slow, measured pace that never varied. Sometimes he would pause near her house, lingering just out of view. She'd hold her breath, the silence outside pressing in on her, waiting for the sound of his footsteps to resume. Only then could she exhale, her heart pounding in her chest. A week after Mr. Harding's arrival, Ellie decided to confront her growing paranoia. He's just a man, she told herself, grabbing a tray of cookies she had baked as a peace offering. Maybe he's just shy, and I'm overthinking things. The house loomed before her as she approached, its windows dark and hollow like the eyes of a corpse. The overgrown garden rustled as if stirred by an unseen breeze, though the air was still. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the heavy, ornate knocker that seemed to stare back at her with an almost malevolent glint. Before she could knock, the door creaked open. Ellie froze. Standing in the shadowy threshold was Mr. Harding. His face was partially obscured in the darkness of the entryway, but what she could see made her stomach turn. His skin appeared ashen, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were set deep into his skull, like black pits devoid of life. "Yes?" he asked, his voice smooth yet brittle, like glass ready to shatter. Ellie forced a smile, though she felt the blood drain from her face. "Hi, I'm Ellie from down the street," she stammered. "I just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." She extended the tray of cookies toward him, her hands trembling slightly. His lips stretched into a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "How very thoughtful," he said, his eyes fixed on hers in a way that made her skin crawl. He stepped aside, the darkness inside the house yawning open. "Won't you come in?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Ellie felt every instinct scream at her to refuse, to turn around and leave, but her feet betrayed her and she stepped forward, drawn in as if by some invisible force. The moment she crossed the threshold, an oppressive chill enveloped her. The air inside was thick, stagnant, and carried a scent of rot mixed with something metallic, like rusted iron. As she entered, her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim lighting. Heavy dark curtains covered the windows, casting the room in deep shadows. The furniture, shrouded in dusty sheets, stood like ancient tombs in the murky darkness. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with volumes that looked centuries old, their spines cracked and titles worn away. "Please sit," Mr. Harding offered, gesturing toward a faded, high-backed chair. Ellie hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest, but sat down. She gripped the tray of cookies tightly in her lap, feeling more vulnerable than ever. Mr. Harding moved to a nearby sideboard and began to pour a cup of tea. The sound of the liquid splashing into the cup seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "Have you settled in all right?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Oh yes," he replied, his back still to her. "Quite settled. The house has a way of welcoming its occupants, doesn't it?" His voice dipped lower on the last words, almost like a whisper meant for someone standing right beside her. Ellie glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched by more than just Mr. Harding. "It's an interesting house," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "We haven't seen much of you around." "No, I've been busy with preparations," he answered, finally turning to face her. He carried the cup of tea to her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. "There are certain rites one must observe when moving into a place like this." "What kind of rites?" Ellie asked before she could stop herself. Mr. Harding's eyes glinted, the faintest hint of amusement crossing his features. "Old ones," he replied simply. "But that's a story for another time." Ellie nodded, unease crawling up her spine. "Well, I should probably get going. It's getting late." "Of course," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "But do come by again, Ellie. It gets lonely here without visitors." She stood quickly, her legs trembling. "Thank you for the tea," she said, her voice quivering as she moved toward the door. The moment she stepped outside, a wave of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned back to say goodbye, she saw Mr. Harding standing in the doorway, his eyes following her with an intensity that made her feel like a cornered animal. "You'll be back," he murmured, his voice drifting toward her on the night air as the door slowly creaked shut. From that night on, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even within the safety of her own home. The nights became restless, filled with whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. Neighbors reported hearing scratching noises and faint, muffled cries that echoed from the direction of Mr. Harding's house. One night, as Ellie lay in bed, she heard something that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They stopped right outside her bedroom window. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The curtains fluttered slightly as if someone was standing on the other side, peering in. Gathering her courage, she leaped out of bed and yanked the curtain aside. No one was there. Only the darkness greeted her, stretching out to the shadowy outline of Mr. Harding's house at the end of the street. But then, in the moonlight, she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, cloaked in shadows. It was Mr. Harding, his face turned upward toward her window, his eyes glinting like twin voids. Ellie gasped, stumbling back from the window. "This isn't happening," she whispered, clamping a hand over her mouth. She rushed to lock every door and window, her heart pounding like a drum. In the days that followed, more neighbors began to disappear. The couple next door went missing, their car left in the driveway, keys still in the ignition. Pets vanished, their collars found torn and discarded in the overgrown lawns. And all the while, Mr. Harding's house remained eerily silent. The curtains never moved and the lights never flickered on. One evening, as darkness settled over the neighborhood like a shroud, Ellie saw a faint, sickly green light emanating from the windows of Mr. Harding's house. It pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the pavement. Unable to contain her fear and curiosity any longer, she grabbed a flashlight and crept out of her house, her breath visible in the cold night air. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to thicken, growing colder and heavier. The ground beneath her feet felt soft and damp, as if the earth itself was decaying. As she reached the front door, she noticed symbols carved into the wood, strange, twisted markings that glowed faintly in the dark. She pushed the door open, and immediately the stench of rot hit her like a wave. The hallway stretched before her, shrouded in darkness, the walls lined with what appeared to be old, yellowing portraits. She stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath her weight, and the door slammed shut behind her. In the flickering green light that spilled from the room at the end of the hall, she saw them, the shadows. They moved along the walls, shifting and twisting, forming grotesque faces that seemed to scream silently. Ellie took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribcage, but a low voice stopped her in her tracks. "You're here, Ellie," it crooned, echoing through the darkness. "I've been waiting." From the room at the end of the hall, Mr. Harding emerged, his face pale and distorted, his eyes now hollow pits that swallowed the light. His smile stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed in the sickly glow. "You see?" he hissed, his voice filling the air with a sense of impending doom. "I needed you. The house needed you. It feeds on those who wander too close." Ellie turned to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly, the front door receding into the distance. Shadows lunged at her, wrapping around her ankles, dragging her toward Mr. Harding. She screamed, thrashing against the tendrils of darkness that pulled at her, but they tightened, cold and unyielding. As she was pulled into the room, the last thing she saw was Mr. Harding's eyes, glowing with a sinister hunger, and behind him the walls began to writhe. Faces of her neighbors, twisted in silent horror, pressed against the wallpaper, their mouths open in screams that would never be heard. The door to the house swung shut, locking itself with a final echoing click. The neighborhood fell silent once more, and Mr. Harding's house stood dark and brooding at the end of the cul-de-sac, waiting for the next neighbor to become curious. Ellie was never seen again, but sometimes late at night, the neighbors would hear whispers drifting through the wind, whispers that echoed with a name: Ellie. And if they dared look, they would see a figure standing at the window of Mr. Harding's house, watching, waiting for the next visitor to enter the darkness.